Good evening. Tonight, we venture into the shadows of history's greatest conquest, where the price of ambition was measured not in gold or territory, but in the slow, agonizing decay of a man's soul. This is the story of Alexander the Great's final days, when the weight of an empire became too heavy for even the strongest shoulders to bear, and when the very victories that made him a legend became the chains that dragged him toward an early grave. Before we march into Babylon for the final time, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you witnessing this tale in the quiet hours before dawn, when shadows are longest and truths cut deepest? Or perhaps it's twilight where you are, that haunting hour when day surrenders to night, much like how Alexander's glory would soon surrender to darkness. And please, subscribe to this channel, because unlike Alexander, who tried to conquer the world too, secure his legacy, you can ensure that knowledge and truth live on with just a single click. The greatest empires fall, but wisdom endures forever. The year is 323 BC. The marble floors of Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon are cold beneath Alexander's feet as he paces through corridors that have witnessed the rise and fall of kings for centuries. The walls seem to whisper the names of forgotten rulers, and tonight they will add another name to their eternal roll call of the dead. At 32 years old, Alexander of Macedon has achieved what no mortal before him ever dared dream. His empire stretches from the wind-swept coasts of Macedonia to the spice-scented valleys of India, from the sun-baked sands of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush. He has walked where gods were said to tread, crossed rivers that men believed were the boundaries of the world, and stood beneath skies that previous generations thought were unreachable. But tonight, as fever ravages his body and paranoia clouds his mind, Alexander is learning the cruelest truth of all, that the higher a man climbs, the farther he has to fall. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like the slow erosion of a mountain by wind and rain, Alexander's descent from god-king to mortal man was a gradual process that began years before his death, rooted in the very victories that made him immortal. Picture, if you will, the moment when everything began to unravel. It's 326 BC, and Alexander stands on the banks of the Hyphasis River in India. Before him stretches an endless expanse of unknown territory, promising new worlds to conquer, new peoples to subjugate, new glory to claim. His eyes, once bright with the fire of conquest, now burn with something darker, something hungrier. But behind him, for the first time in his life, his men are saying no. The sound of their refusal doesn't come as a roar of defiance. Instead, it begins as a whisper, spreading through the ranks like a plague. Soldiers who have followed him across 3 continents, who have bled for him in 100 battles, who have watched their comrades die for his dreams, finally reach their breaking point. Coenus, one of his most trusted generals, steps forward. His weathered face tells the story of a decade spent in Alexander's service, etched with scars from battles fought in his king's name. When he speaks, his voice carries the weight of exhaustion that has settled into the bones of every man in the army. "My lord," Coenus says, and in those 2 words, Alexander hears something he has never heard before, something that chills him more than any winter in Scythia ever could. He hears pity. "We have followed you to the ends of the earth. We have crossed rivers that our fathers never knew existed, climbed mountains that touch the sky, and fought peoples whose names we cannot even pronounce. We have given you our youth, our strength, our blood, but we are not gods, Alexander. We are men, and men have limits. The silence that follows is deafening." Alexander looks into the faces of soldiers who once would have charged into the underworld itself if he commanded it. Now, he sees something that makes his heart clench with a fear more profound than any he felt facing the Persian war elephants or the Scythian horsemen. He sees mortality reflected back at him. He sees men who have suddenly remembered that they are not immortal, that they have families they have not seen in years, that they have grown old in service to his ambitions. And in their eyes, he sees a question that cuts him to the core. What about our dreams, Alexander? What about our lives? The moment stretches like an eternity. The wind from the river carries with it the scent of unknown lands beyond, lands that will forever remain beyond Alexander's reach. In that breeze, he can almost hear the laughter of gods mocking his pretensions to divinity. The sound cuts through him like a blade forged from his own broken dreams. Around him, his officers shift uncomfortably. These are men who have watched Alexander achieve impossible things, who have seen him turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will. But now they see something they have never witnessed before. Alexander at a loss for words, the great orator, the inspirational leader who could move men to follow him into hell itself, stands silent before the simple truth of human limitation. For 3 days, Alexander refuses to emerge from his tent. He lies on his bed, staring at the leather walls that seem to close in around him with each passing hour. Outside, he can hear the sounds of an army that has stopped moving forward for the first time in a decade. The sound terrifies him more than the clash of swords or the thunder of cavalry charges ever did. During those 3 days of self-imposed isolation, Alexander experiences something he has never known before, the crushing weight of failure. Not military failure, for his army remains undefeated. Not political failure, for his empire stretches farther than any before it. But personal failure, the failure to transcend the limitations that define all mortal men. He thinks of his teacher Aristotle, who warned him about the dangers of hubris, about the fate that awaits mortals who try to rival the gods. He remembers his mother Olympias telling him stories of heroes who flew too close to the sun and fell to earth with melted wings. These memories, once dismissed as the fears of lesser minds, now haunt him with their prophetic accuracy. But most painful of all, he thinks about the boy he used to be. The young prince who dreamed not of endless conquest, but of glorious adventure, who imagined himself as Achilles fighting before the walls of Troy, seeking honor and fame, but always with the understanding that mortality gave meaning to heroic deeds. When did he stop wanting to be Achilles and start trying to be Zeus? When did the pursuit of glory become the pursuit of godhood? When did the boy who wept reading the Iliad become the man who saw other human beings as obstacles to his divine destiny? When he finally emerges from his tent on the 4th day, something fundamental has changed. The light in his eyes has dimmed, replaced by a cold fire that burns not with joy in conquest, but with bitter resentment at being denied. For the first time in his life, Alexander has been forced to turn back. For the first time in his life, the word impossible has been spoken in his presence and made to stick. He orders the construction of 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, each one dedicated to the Olympian gods. But those who know him best can see the truth behind this apparent act of piety. These are not altars of gratitude. They are monuments to frustration, markers of the place where Alexander's dream of infinite conquest died. The altars themselves become symbols of everything that has gone wrong with Alexander's vision. They are magnificent structures, built with the skill and artistry that mark all of his architectural projects. But they stand empty, monuments to gods who seem to have abandoned their most ambitious worshipper. Local priests come to make offerings at these altars, but they speak in whispers about the strange atmosphere that surrounds them. The structures seem to radiate not peace or holiness, but a kind of bitter sadness, as if they were built not to honor the gods, but to accuse them of cruelty. As the army begins its long journey back, Alexander's behavior becomes increasingly erratic. The easy camaraderie he once shared with his men begins to evaporate, replaced by a distance that feels as vast as the territories they have conquered. He starts spending more time alone, more time drinking, more time staring into fires with eyes that seem to see things that aren't there. His bodyguards notice that he has begun talking to himself during these solitary vigils. Sometimes he argues with invisible opponents, defending decisions that no one has questioned. Other times he seems to be pleading with someone who isn't there, begging for understanding or forgiveness for crimes that exist only in his own mind. The change in Alexander affects the entire army. The soldiers who once competed for the privilege of serving in his personal guard now draw lots to see who must stand watch during his dark moods. They speak in hushed tones about their king's transformation, wondering if the man they followed out of Macedonia has been replaced by some spirit of the vast Asian steppes. His officers are even more disturbed by what they see. These are men who have known Alexander since boyhood, who remember the charming prince who could make anyone love him with a smile and a joke. That man seems to have vanished somewhere in the dust and heat of endless campaigns, replaced by someone who looks familiar but feels like a stranger. The first sign of true paranoia emerges during the journey through Gedrossia, a desert so harsh that it makes the Sahara seem hospitable. Alexander chooses this route not because it is strategic, but because he wants to accomplish something that even Cyrus the Great failed to do. He wants to prove that he is greater than the greatest kings of the past, even if it means marching his army through hell itself. The decision to cross Gedrossia reveals the depth of Alexander's psychological damage. A rational commander would have chosen the coastal route, following established supply lines and trading posts. But rationality has become foreign to Alexander's thinking. He is driven now not by military necessity, but by a desperate need to prove that he is still capable of achieving the impossible. The desert takes its toll immediately. The sun beats down with merciless intensity during the day, turning armor into furnaces and making every step an act of will. The heat is so intense that it seems to have physical weight, pressing down on the marching men like an invisible mountain. Nights bring no relief, only a different kind of torture. The temperature drops so rapidly that men who were sweating at sunset find themselves shivering before midnight. The cold seeps into bones and joints already weakened by heat and exhaustion, creating a misery that seems to compound with each passing hour. Water becomes more precious than gold, food more valuable than jewels. The army's supply train, never designed for desert warfare, begins to fail almost immediately. Pack animals collapse and die, their precious cargoes scattered across sand dunes that will swallow it forever. Soldiers begin to die not from enemy weapons, but from thirst, exhaustion, and despair. The men who have followed Alexander through every conceivable hardship find themselves facing something worse than any human enemy: the implacable hostility of nature itself. But what truly disturbs those around Alexander is how he seems to thrive on their suffering. There's something almost manic in the way he pushes forward, as if the hardships of his men somehow feed the hungry void that has been growing inside him since the Hyphasis River. When soldiers collapse from heat stroke, Alexander doesn't show the compassion that once defined his leadership. Instead, he orders them left behind, claiming that the army cannot be slowed by weakness. When officers question the wisdom of the route, he responds with accusations of cowardice and disloyalty. Most disturbing of all, he seems genuinely energized by the challenge of the crossing. While his men grow weaker with each passing day, Alexander appears to gain strength from their struggle. It's as if he has found in the desert the opponent he has been seeking, something that will fight him without mercy or compromise. The psychological implications of this behavior are lost on no one who witnesses it. Alexander has begun to see his own army not as comrades in arms, but as obstacles to his personal glory. Their suffering has become a source of satisfaction rather than concern. Their deaths are acceptable casualties in his war against his own limitations. It's during this hellish march that the first whispers of conspiracy begin to circulate. Not among the common soldiers, who are too exhausted to think of anything beyond their next sip of water, but among the officers who have grown increasingly troubled by their king's behavior. Late at night, gathered around dying fires with the desert wind howling round them, they speak in hushed tones about the changes they have seen in Alexander. They remember the young prince who used to share his meals with common soldiers, who would personally tend to the wounded after battles, who seemed to genuinely care about the lives of the men who followed him. That man seems to have died somewhere in the vastness of Asia, replaced by someone who views his army not as comrades, but as tools to be used and discarded in service, to an ambition that has grown beyond all reason. Craterus, one of Alexander's oldest friends, finds himself wondering if they have created a monster. In quiet moments, he remembers the boy he knew in Macedonia, the prince who would sneak out of the palace to train with common soldiers, who would spend hours listening to his tutor, Aristotle, speak about philosophy and the nature of good governance. Where did that boy go? When did Alexander stop being a king and become something else entirely? Something that wore a human face but seemed to have forgotten what it meant to be human. The answer, Craterus realizes with growing horror, is that it happened so gradually that none of them noticed until it was too late. Each victory had fed Alexander's hunger for more victories. Each conquered city had only revealed new cities to conquer. Each defeated enemy had only shown him new enemies to defeat. Like a man addicted to wine who no longer drinks for pleasure but simply to avoid the pain of sobriety, Alexander has become addicted to conquest. And like all addicts, he has reached the point where the thing he craves is also the thing that is destroying him. Ptolemy, another of Alexander's childhood companions, finds himself having similar thoughts. He watches Alexander during their evening councils and sees not the brilliant strategist he once knew, but a man consumed by something that might have been genius once, but has curdled into madness. The discussions around these desert campfires grow more serious with each passing night. The officers begin to speak not just about Alexander's behavior, but about their own responsibilities to the empire and to the men under their command. They talk about what they owe to their king versus what they owe to their consciences. These are not casual conversations about replacing an unpopular leader. These are profound moral discussions about the nature of loyalty and the limits of obedience. The men having them are not ambitious generals seeking power for themselves, but loyal friends who are watching someone they love destroy himself and everyone around him. The march through Gedrosia becomes a metaphor for Alexander's entire life. He pushes forward not because he knows where he is going, but because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness that lies at the heart of his existence. The desert around them mirrors the spiritual wasteland that his soul has become. When they finally emerge from the desert, what remains of the army is a shadow of what entered it. Thousands of men have died for no reason other than Alexander's need to prove something to himself. The survivors look at their king with eyes that no longer hold admiration or even fear. They hold something far more dangerous: indifference. The casualty reports from the Gedrosia crossing read like a catalogue of preventable tragedy. Entire units have been reduced to scattered handfuls of survivors. Supply companies have vanished completely. their men and animals swallowed by the sand. The engineering cause, essential for siege warfare, has lost half its strength to heat and thirst. But the human cost goes beyond mere numbers. The survivors of the crossing are changed men, marked by an experience that has stripped away their illusions about their king and their cause. They have seen Alexander sacrifice thousands of lives, not for military necessity, but for personal satisfaction. The bond of trust that once held the army together has been severed as cleanly as if cut by a sword. The men still follow orders, but they do so with the mechanical obedience of slaves rather than the willing service of free soldiers. The spark that made them invincible has been extinguished in the fires of the desert. But Alexander seems oblivious to the change. If anything, he appears energized by having survived the desert crossing. He speaks of it as another victory, another achievement to add to his list of accomplishments. He doesn't see the hollow looks in his men's eyes, or hear the bitter edge that has crept into their voices when they speak of him. This disconnect between Alexander's perception and reality becomes one of the most troubling aspects of his psychological decline. He has lost the ability to accurately read the mood of his followers, the political instinct that once made him such an effective leader. In his mind, the desert crossing has proven his superiority over all previous conquerors. He has accomplished what Cyrus could not, survived where lesser men would have perished. The fact that this victory has cost him the loyalty of his army doesn't register in his calculations. It's at this point that the political situation in his empire begins to deteriorate rapidly. While Alexander has been pursuing his dreams of infinite conquest, the vast territories he has already won are starting to fracture. His governors, left to rule distant provinces with minimal oversight, have begun to act like independent kings. Reports reach him of corruption, rebellion, and outright treachery throughout his empire. Provinces that he conquered years ago are slipping away, their people rising up against his appointed rulers. The carefully constructed system of governance that's supposed to hold his empire together is collapsing like a house built on sand. The scale of the administrative crisis is staggering. In Bactria, his governor Bessus has declared independence and begun minting his own coins. In Syria, tax collectors appointed by Alexander have been murdered by angry populations. In Egypt, the priests have stopped recognizing his divine status and begun speaking of him as just another foreign conqueror. These reports arrive in a steady stream, each one describing new failures and fresh rebellions. The empire that Alexander thought was secure is revealing itself to be nothing more than a collection of conquered territories held together by fear and habit. Alexander's response to this crisis reveals just how much he has changed. Instead of returning immediately to restore order, instead of recognizing that his long absence has created these problems, he becomes consumed with rage at what he sees as the betrayal of his trust. He begins issuing execution orders with terrifying frequency. Governors who have served him faithfully for years find themselves condemned to death on the basis of rumors and accusations. The line between justice and paranoia becomes increasingly blurred as Alexander sees enemies everywhere. The most shocking of these executions is that of Parmenion, one of his father's oldest generals and one of the architects of his early victories. Parmenion has been like a father to Alexander, a steady voice of wisdom and experience in a world of young ambition and reckless courage. The circumstances surrounding Parmenion's death reveal the depths to which Alexander has sunk. The old general is executed not for any proven crime, but because his son Philotas has been accused of treason. Alexander doesn't just condemn the son, he orders the execution of the father as well, claiming that family loyalty makes Parmenion too dangerous to live. The message is clear: no one is safe, no service too loyal, no friendship too deep to protect against Alexander's suspicions. The execution orders are carried out with brutal efficiency, sending shock waves through the army and the court. The execution of Parmenion sends shock waves through the army and the court. If someone with Parmenion's record of loyalty and service can be killed on mere suspicion, then anyone can be. The atmosphere around Alexander becomes poisoned with fear and mistrust. His inner circle, the men who have been his companions since childhood, begin to watch their words and actions with paranoid care. They start to feel like courtiers in the palace of a tyrant, rather than friends and advisors of a king. The easy camaraderie that once existed between Alexander and his companions dies, replaced by a formal distance that feels as cold as winter in Macedonia. Conversations that once flowed freely now become exercises in diplomatic precision. Men who grew up together, who shared the dangers and triumphs of a decade of conquest, find themselves weighing every word for potential treasonous implications. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. These men have defined themselves through their relationship with Alexander, built their identities around their role as his companions and advisors. Now they find themselves strangers in their own lives, afraid to speak honestly to the person they once considered their closest friend. But perhaps the most telling sign of Alexander's deterioration is how he begins to treat those who dare to speak truth to him. When Cletus the Black, his foster brother and one of his oldest friends, challenges him during a drunken feast, Alexander's response reveals the depths to which he has fallen. The feast takes place in Maracanda, in the palace of a conquered king whose name is already being forgotten. The irony is not lost on the more thoughtful of Alexander's companions. They sit in the halls of a dead empire, dining off the gold plates of a vanished dynasty, while their own king transforms into something that would have been recognizable to the tyrants of the past. Cletus, emboldened by wine and frustrated by years of watching Alexander's transformation, speaks words that have been whispered in private for months. He reminds Alexander that his victories were won not by divine favor alone, but by the blood and sacrifice of Macedonian soldiers. He suggests that Alexander has forgotten his roots, that he has become too enamored with Persian customs and Eastern flattery. You sit there in your Persian robes, demanding that free Macedonians prostrate themselves before you like slaves, Cletus says, his voice carrying the pain of a man watching his brother become a stranger. You speak of your divine father Ammon, while insulting the memory of Philip, the man who actually gave you life and taught you how to fight. The words hang in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Everyone in the hall can feel the tension building, can sense that they are about to witness something terrible and irreversible. Alexander's face goes white, then red, as if he has been struck a physical blow. The truth of Cletus's words hits him like lightning, illuminating for a terrible moment the distance he has traveled from the boy he used to be. But instead of prompting self-reflection, the words trigger a rage so pure and terrible that it seems to come from some primal place in his soul. Alexander's eyes become those of a wild animal, completely divorced from human reason or compassion. In a moment of blind fury, he grabs a spear from one of his guards and drives it through Cletus's heart. The silence that follows is absolute. The great hall, moments before filled with the sounds of feasting and conversation, becomes as quiet as a tomb. Alexander stands over the body of his foster brother, the spear still in his hands, looking like a man who has just awakened from a nightmare to find that it was real. The immediate aftermath of Cletus's murder reveals just how isolated Alexander has become. His companions are too shocked and frightened to speak. The Persian nobles who have been invited to the feast watch with calculating eyes, filing away this display of murderous volatility for future use. Alexander himself seems stunned by what he has done. He drops the spear and falls to his knees beside Cletus's body, calling out his name as if words could somehow restore life to the still form. For a moment, the mask of divine kingship slips, and those present see not a god-king, but a man who has just realized the price of his unchecked power. The blood pooling beneath Cletus's body reflects the torchlight like a mirror, creating a grotesque tableau that will haunt the nightmares of everyone present. In that spreading crimson stain, they see not just the death of a good man, but the death of something essential in Alexander himself. For 3 days, Alexander remains in his quarters, refusing to eat or see anyone. Those close to him can hear him through the walls, sometimes raging at the gods, sometimes weeping like a child. He calls out to Cletus, begging for forgiveness that will never come, apologizing to a dead man who can no longer hear him. During these 3 days of self-imposed exile, Alexander experiences something approaching a complete psychological breakdown. The guilt over Cletus's death combines with years of accumulated stress and moral compromise to create a crisis that threatens his sanity. He alternates between violent rage and profound despair, sometimes destroying furniture and artwork in fits of fury, other times lying motionless for hours as if he were dead himself. His bodyguards take turns listening at his door, ready to intervene if his self-destructive behavior threatens his life. The philosophical implications of what he has done torment him more than the political consequences. In killing Cletus, he has destroyed one of his last connections to the person he used to be. The boy from Macedonia who valued friendship and loyalty above all else has murdered his own foster brother in a drunken rage. When he finally emerges, something in him has broken that will never be repaired. He goes through the motions of kingship, but those who knew him before can see that the murder of Cletus has created a wound in his soul that will never heal. From this point forward, Alexander's descent accelerates. He begins to surround himself increasingly with Persian advisors and Eastern courtiers who tell him what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. The Macedonian nobles who once formed his inner circle find themselves pushed to the margins, replaced by men who view flattery as the highest form of diplomacy. This shift in his inner circle creates a dangerous dynamic. The Persians, still smarting from their defeat and looking for ways to regain influence, begin to play on Alexander's paranoia and vanity. They whisper suggestions in his ear, plant seeds of doubt about the loyalty of his Macedonian companions, and gradually turn him against the very men who made his conquests possible. The Persian courtiers are masters of a game that the straightforward Macedonians never learned to play. They understand that power is often wielded more effectively through suggestion than through direct command, that a king's fears can be more useful than his affections. They speak to Alexander of the divine nature of kingship, of his superiority not just to ordinary men but to the gods themselves. They tell him stories of Persian kings who ruled for centuries, whose power was so absolute that they were worshipped as living deities by millions of subjects. These conversations feed something hungry in Alexander's damaged psyche. The boy who once dreamed of heroic adventure has been replaced by a man desperate for validation of his significance. The Persians offer him a version of himself that is godlike, eternal, worthy of the suffering he has endured and the crimes he has committed. At the same time, his adoption of Persian customs and dress becomes more pronounced. He begins wearing the diadem of a Persian king, adopts the practice of prosthenesis, requiring visitors to prostrate themselves before him, and speaks increasingly of his divine nature. To the Macedonians, these changes are not just political missteps, they are betrayals of everything they hold sacred. The boy they followed out of Macedonia has become something foreign and frightening. A stranger wearing familiar features but speaking with an alien voice. The cultural implications of Alexander's transformation run deeper than mere politics. To the Macedonians, their identity is bound up in their relationship with their king. He is not just their ruler, but their representative, the embodiment of their values and aspirations. When Alexander adopts Persian customs, he doesn't just change his own behavior, he changes what it means to be Macedonian. The soldiers who have conquered the world in his name find themselves commanded by someone who seems to prefer the culture of the conquered to that of the conquerors. This cultural betrayal creates a psychological crisis throughout the army. Men who have risked their lives to spread Macedonian influence find themselves wondering if they have actually been working to destroy their own heritage. The tension between Alexander and his Macedonian followers reaches a breaking point during the mass wedding ceremony at Susa. Alexander orders his officers to marry Persian noblewomen in a grand gesture meant to unite East and West. On the surface, it seems like a brilliant political move, cementing alliances and creating bonds between the conquerors and the conquered. But the Macedonians see it differently. To them, it feels like forced assimilation, an attempt to dilute their identity and merge it with the culture of their former enemies. They comply with the order because they must, but their resentment grows like a cancer in the heart of the army. The wedding ceremony itself becomes a symbol of everything that has gone wrong. Alexander, dressed in Persian royal garments and surrounded by Eastern luxury, presides over the marriages with an air of satisfied accomplishment. He sees unity where his men see surrender, progress where they see betrayal. The ceremony takes place in the ancient palace of Darius, with all the pomp and circumstance that Persian tradition demands. The very setting serves as a reminder of how far Alexander has traveled from his Macedonian roots. 10,000 of his soldiers are compelled to take Persian wives in a single ceremony that lasts for days. The scale of the event is unprecedented, designed to demonstrate Alexander's power and vision. But the forced nature of the marriages creates an atmosphere of resentment that no amount of ceremonial splendor can disguise. The Persian brides, many of them daughters and sisters of men who died fighting against Alexander, go through the ceremony with stoic dignity, but in their eyes, the observant can see calculation. They understand that this ceremony gives them access to power, a chance to influence the conquerors through the intimate bonds of marriage. What Alexander doesn't realize is that he has created a perfect storm of resentment and opportunity. His Macedonian officers feel betrayed and marginalized, while the Persians see a chance to regain influence through manipulation and intrigue. The empire that he thought he was strengthening is actually being torn apart from within. The political consequences of the mass marriages become apparent almost immediately. The Macedonian officers who have been forced into these unions find themselves caught between conflicting loyalties. Their Persian wives bring with them connections to the old aristocracy, family obligations that may conflict with their duties to Alexander. Meanwhile, the Persian families see the marriages as an opportunity to reclaim some of their lost status. They begin to work on their new sons-in-law, subtly undermining their loyalty to Alexander while building alternative power structures within the empire. The first serious challenge to his authority comes from an unexpected source: his own soldiers. When Alexander announces his intention to discharge his veterans and send them home with generous pensions, he expects gratitude. Instead, he faces open mutiny. The mutiny at Opis is not like the quiet refusal at the Hyphasis River. This is angry, bitter, and personal. The soldiers who confront Alexander are not just tired of fighting. They are tired of being treated like expendable tools in service to an ambition they no longer understand or support. Their spokesman, a grizzled veteran named Atarius, speaks words that cut Alexander deeper than any enemy sword ever has. He tells Alexander that they have served him faithfully for years, not because he is a god, but because he was once one of them. He reminds Alexander of the boy who used to share their hardships, who would personally carry wounded soldiers from the battlefield, who treated them like brothers rather than subjects. That boy is dead, Atarius says, his voice carrying the pain of a broken heart. You killed him somewhere along the road to glory, and we have been following his ghost ever since. The words strike Alexander like physical blows. In them, he hears not just criticism, but mourning. These men are not just rejecting his authority, they are grieving for the person he used to be. Around him, thousands of soldiers nod in agreement with Atarius' words. These are not rebellious troops seeking better conditions. These are heartbroken men who have watched someone they loved transform into someone they can no longer recognize. Alexander's response to the mutiny reveals just how far he has fallen. Instead of trying to understand their grievances, instead of recognizing the legitimate pain behind their anger, he sees only defiance of his authority. He orders the arrest and execution of the ringleaders, sending a message that dissent will not be tolerated. But the executions backfire spectacularly. Instead of cowing the army into submission, they create martyrs. The men who are executed become symbols of Macedonian honor and Alexander's betrayal of it. Their deaths poison the relationship between Alexander and his army beyond any hope of repair. The executions are carried out with theatrical brutality, designed to intimidate as much as to punish. The condemned men are given no chance to defend themselves, no opportunity to explain their actions. They are simply dragged away and killed, their bodies left as warnings to anyone who might dare question their king's judgment. But the plan backfires completely. Instead of fear, the executions create a cold rage that spreads through the army like wildfire. Men who have served Alexander for years begin to speak openly of their hatred for what he has become. The army continues to follow Alexander's orders because they must, but the love is gone. The devotion is gone. What remains is fear and obligation, the bonds that hold together the armies of tyrants, not the willing service that creates legendary victories. Alexander seems to sense the change, but lacks the self-awareness to understand its cause. He becomes increasingly isolated, trusting only a small circle of advisors who tell him what he wants to hear. He spends more time drinking, more time alone, more time lost in dreams of future conquests that will somehow restore the glory he feels slipping away. During this period of growing isolation, Alexander's drinking becomes more than just a recreational habit. It becomes a desperate attempt to escape the reality of what his life has become. The wine provides temporary refuge from the crushing weight of his failures and the growing certainty of his mortality. His drinking sessions become legendary for their duration and intensity. He can consume vast quantities of wine without apparent effect, as if his body has adapted to function despite constant intoxication. But those close to him can see the toll it takes on his judgment and his health. The physical deterioration is gradual but unmistakable. His famous beauty begins to fade, replaced by the bloated features of a chronic alcoholic. His legendary endurance starts to fail, leaving him unable to maintain the punishing pace that once characterized his campaigns. But more troubling than the physical changes are the mental ones. Alexander's famous memory, once capable of recalling the names and faces of thousands of soldiers, begins to fail him. He starts repeating stories, forgetting decisions he made days before, and confusing past events with present realities. It's during this period of isolation and increasing instability that the rumors about his death begin to circulate. Not prophecies or omens, but actual discussions among his officers about what would happen when Alexander dies. The conversation is no longer about if he will die, but when and what will happen to the empire afterward. The most disturbing aspect of these discussions is how coldly practical they are. His generals talk about dividing up the empire like merchants discussing the distribution of goods. There's no grief in these conversations, no sense of impending loss. There's only calculation and ambition. Antipater in Macedonia, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Antigonus in Asia Minor, each of them begins to position himself for the coming succession crisis. They start building personal loyalties among the troops, accumulating resources, and making alliances that have nothing to do with serving Alexander, and everything to do with serving their own interests after he's gone. The irony is terrible and complete. Alexander, who has spent his life conquering the world to build an empire that will last forever, has created a system so dependent on his personal charisma and authority that it will collapse the moment he dies. The empire that was supposed to be his immortal legacy will become his greatest failure. The succession planning, or rather the complete lack of it, reveals perhaps the most catastrophic aspect of Alexander's reign. A man who could organize the conquest of 3 continents with mathematical precision has given no thought to what will happen when he is no longer there to hold his empire together. Part of this failure stems from Alexander's inability to accept his own mortality. Despite the evidence of his declining health and increasing isolation, he continues to act as if he will live forever. The idea of preparing a successor requires acknowledging that he is replaceable, something his ego simply cannot accept. But there's also a darker possibility that Alexander's failure to name an heir is deliberate. Some of his closest observers begin to suspect that he would rather see his empire destroyed than see it survive under someone else's rule. The man who cannot bear to be denied anything may have decided that, if he cannot live forever, then his empire should die with him. This possibility becomes more plausible as Alexander's behavior becomes increasingly self-destructive. He takes unnecessary risks in battle, drinks to dangerous excess, and makes decisions that seem designed to provoke rebellion rather than prevent it. His famous visit to the Oracle of Zusammen in the desert of Libya takes on new significance in this context. When Alexander emerged from his private consultation with the oracle, he claimed to have been told that he was the son of Zeus himself, not of Philip of Macedon. At the time, this claim seemed like a brilliant political move, designed to legitimize his rule over peoples who expected their kings to have divine heritage. But now, his companions begin to wonder if Alexander actually believed what he claimed the oracle told him. If Alexander truly believes he is divine, then his inability to accept human limitations makes terrible sense. Gods don't need successors because gods don't die. Gods don't need to worry about the consequences of their actions because gods are beyond human judgment. This delusion of divinity becomes the lens through which Alexander views all of his subsequent failures. When his men refuse to march further into India, it's not because they have reached the limits of human endurance. It's because they lack the divine vision to see beyond mortal concerns. When his empire begins to fracture, it's not because he has neglected the practical work of governance. It's because lesser beings cannot maintain what a god has created. When his closest friends turn against him, it's not because he has betrayed their trust. It's because mortals are incapable of understanding divine purpose. This worldview makes Alexander increasingly dangerous to everyone around him. If he is divine and they are mortal, then their lives have no inherent value except as they serve his purposes. Their suffering becomes irrelevant, their deaths acceptable casualties in service to something greater than they can comprehend. As we approach the final act of this tragedy, Alexander arrives in Babylon. In the spring of 323 BC, the city that will become his tomb welcomes him with all the pomp and ceremony due to a conquering king. The streets are lined with flowers, the temples burn with incense, and the people cheer his name. But the celebration feels hollow to those who know Alexander well. The crowds that line the streets are cheering not for the man but for the legend, not for who he is but for who they think he is. They see the golden armor and the purple cloak and imagine they are witnessing the triumph of a hero. Alexander himself seems to be going through the motions of triumph without feeling any of its joy. He rides through the streets of Babylon like an actor playing a role he no longer believes in, acknowledging the cheers with mechanical gestures that lack any genuine emotion. Those close to Alexander notice troubling signs. He seems tired in a way that sleep cannot cure. His famous energy, the restless vitality that once seemed inexhaustible, has been replaced by a weariness that penetrates to his bones. He moves through the ceremonies and receptions like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The Persian magi who serve in the temples of Babylon study Alexander with ancient eyes and see death walking beside him. They speak in whispers of omens and portents, of the curse that falls upon those who reach too high and fly too close to the sun. The omens they report are numerous and disturbing. Ravens fall dead from the sky as Alexander's procession passes. Sacred fires go out despite the absence of wind. The waters of the Euphrates run red for 3 days without any natural explanation. But the most ominous sign comes from the Chaldean astronomers who have served Babylon's kings for centuries. They read in the stars a pattern they have seen before, the celestial signature that marks the death of kings. When they try to warn Alexander, he dismisses their concerns with angry contempt. This rejection of the astronomers' warnings reveals how completely Alexander has lost touch with the wisdom that once guided him. In his youth, he valued counsel from all sources, understanding that wisdom could come from unexpected places. Now, he listens only to voices that confirm his own desires. But the most ominous sign is how Alexander himself seems to sense his approaching end. He begins to speak of death not as a distant possibility, but as an immediate reality. He starts making arrangements for the succession, though his plans reveal a man whose judgment has been clouded by years of paranoia and isolation. Instead of choosing a clear successor and preparing him for the responsibilities of empire, Alexander seems to delight in keeping everyone guessing. He speaks vaguely of the strongest inheriting his empire, a phrase that guarantees civil war among his generals. It's as if he wants his empire to die with him, as if he cannot bear the thought of someone else succeeding where he will fail. The succession question becomes a source of constant tension in the palace. Alexander's generals watch each other with growing suspicion, each one wondering who has the king's favor and who might be designated as heir. Some lobby for Alexander's infant son by Roxana, arguing that blood should determine succession. Others advocate for a regency council that would rule until the child comes of age. Still others suggest that the empire should be divided among the most capable generals, each ruling a portion as an independent king. Alexander encourages these competing factions, seeming to enjoy the uncertainty and conflict his silence creates. He makes contradictory statements to different groups, promising each of them consideration while committing to none. This deliberate ambiguity about the succession reveals the cruel streak that has always existed in Alexander's character, but has grown stronger with each passing year. He has become someone who derives satisfaction from the suffering of others, even those who have served him faithfully. The drinking that has been a problem for years becomes a serious crisis in Babylon. Alexander consumes wine not for pleasure, but to numb the pain of his isolation and the growing awareness of his failures. His companions watch with growing alarm as he drinks himself into stupors that last for days, emerging only to drink again. The quantities of wine Alexander consumes during this period are staggering, even by ancient standards. He can empty amphora after amphora without apparent effect, as if the alcohol is being absorbed by some bottomless void inside him. But the psychological effects of his drinking are evident to everyone around him. The wine doesn't make him happy or relaxed. Instead, it seems to amplify his paranoia and rage. His drunken ramblings become increasingly incoherent and threatening. During these drinking sessions, Alexander often speaks of grand plans for future conquests. He talks of invading Arabia, of sailing around Africa, of conquering the western lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But there's something manic in these discussions, as if he's trying to convince himself as much as his listeners. The plans he describes are increasingly fantastical and impractical. He speaks of armies that don't exist, of resources that have already been exhausted, of logistics that would be impossible even for someone in perfect health with unlimited time. His companions listen to these drunken schemes with growing alarm. They recognize that Alexander is living in a fantasy world, detached from the practical realities of empire and command. The man who once planned his campaigns with meticulous attention to detail now speaks of conquests that exist only in his wine-soaked imagination. It's during one of these extended drinking sessions that Alexander becomes seriously ill. The fever that strikes him is not like the normal illnesses that occasionally affect even the strongest men. This is something deeper, more insidious, something that seems to attack not just his body, but his very life force. The illness begins subtly, with what seems like a normal hangover from another night of heavy drinking. Alexander wakes feeling nauseated and weak, symptoms that his companions initially attribute to his excessive consumption of wine. But as the hours pass, it becomes clear that this is something more serious. The nausea doesn't fade with rest and water. Instead, it intensifies, accompanied by severe abdominal pain that makes Alexander double over in agony. The symptoms are alarming from the start. High fever, severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, and a weakness that seems to drain the strength from his limbs like water poured from a broken cup. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the change in his mental state. The paranoia that has been growing for years suddenly explodes into full-blown delusion. Alexander becomes convinced that he is being poisoned by his own people. He sees assassins in every shadow, poison in every cup, treachery in every face. His chambers become a fortress where he trusts no one and suspects everyone. The fever creates hallucinations that blend with his existing paranoia to create a nightmarish mental landscape. He sees Cletus standing in the corners of his room, pointing an accusing finger and speaking words of condemnation. He sees Parmenion shaking his head in disappointment, his ghostly form bearing the wounds of his execution. But most terrifying of all, he sees himself as a young boy, innocent and hopeful, asking him questions he cannot answer. "Why did you become this?" the phantom child asks. "Why did you throw away everything that mattered for things that don't matter at all?" The doctors who attend him are baffled by his condition. Some suspect poison, others believe it's a natural illness brought on by years of stress and abuse of his body. But all of them can see that whatever is killing Alexander is doing so with terrifying efficiency. The medical knowledge of the ancient world is limited, and the physicians who examine Alexander can only describe his symptoms without understanding their cause. They speak of an imbalance of humors, of divine displeasure, of curses and poisons, but none of their explanations provide any hope for a cure. The most skilled doctors in the empire are summoned to Babylon. Egyptian physicians who have studied the mysteries of life and death for centuries. Indian healers who understand the connection between mind and body. Persian magi who claim to know the secrets of the soul itself, but none of them can help. Alexander's condition worsens with each passing day, his body betraying him as completely as his empire is betraying his dreams. The man who seemed invincible in battle proves pitifully vulnerable to the invisible enemies that attack from within. As news of his illness spreads throughout the empire, the reaction reveals just how precarious his hold on power has become. Instead of prayers for his recovery, there are whispered discussions about secession. Instead of grief at the prospect of losing their king, there's barely concealed excitement about the opportunities his death will create. In the palace at Babylon, his generals gather not to comfort their dying king, but to position themselves for the coming power struggle. They speak in hushed tones about their plans, their alliances, their claims to various parts of the empire. The man who conquered the world is dying alone, surrounded by people who are already dividing up his legacy. The political maneuvering that takes place during Alexander's illness is breathtaking in its cynicism. Men who have fought beside him for years, who owe their positions and wealth to his favor, begin planning for a future that doesn't include him. Secret meetings take place in darkened chambers throughout the palace. Messengers carrying coded letters slip through corridors like shadows. Alliances are formed and broken with the speed of summer lightning as the various factions try to position themselves for the coming struggle. Perdiccas, who holds the royal seal, begins acting as if he is already regent. He issues orders in Alexander's name without consulting the dying king, gradually assuming the powers of rulership, while Alexander lies helpless in his bed. Ptolemy starts making arrangements to return to Egypt, where he has built a power base independent of Alexander's authority. He speaks publicly of his loyalty to his dying king, while privately preparing to declare independence the moment Alexander breathes his last. Seleucus begins consolidating his control over the eastern provinces, using his knowledge of Persian and Indian customs to build relationships with local rulers who are already planning their own rebellions against Macedonian rule. The most heartbreaking aspect of Alexander's final days is his growing awareness of his isolation. In his lucid moments, he can see the calculating looks in the eyes of his companions, can sense the eagerness with which they await his death. The boy who dreamed of conquering the world to win immortal glory realizes that he will be forgotten as soon as he stops breathing. He calls for his closest friends, but they come to his bedside not as mourners but as ambitious men seeking final advantage. He tries to speak of his achievements, but his words fall on deaf ears. The empire he built, the cities he founded, the peoples he conquered, all of it means nothing to the men who are already planning to tear it apart. When Ptolemy visits Alexander's sickbed, he speaks words of comfort and loyalty, but his eyes are already planning the journey back to Egypt. When Seleucus kneels beside the dying king, he offers prayers for recovery while mentally cataloguing the resources he will need to secure the eastern provinces. Even Roxana, Alexander's wife and the mother of his heir, seems more concerned with her own political position than with her husband's suffering. She spends her time building alliances with Persian nobles who can protect her after Alexander's death, rather than comforting him in his final hours. The loneliness Alexander experiences during his final illness is perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. The man who commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands dies surrounded by people who care more about his death than his life. In his delirium, Alexander begins to speak of regrets. He talks about the friends he has killed, the soldiers he has sacrificed, the dreams he has betrayed. He calls out for his mother, Olympias, for his friend Hephaestion, who died the year before, for Cleitus, whom he murdered in his rage. The mention of Hephaestion's death opens another wound in the narrative of Alexander's decline. Hephaestion had been more than just Alexander's closest friend. He had been the one person who could still reach the humanity buried beneath layers of royal paranoia and divine pretension. When Hephaestion died of fever in Ecbatana in 324 BC, Alexander's grief was so profound that it bordered on madness. He ordered the crucifixion of the doctor who failed to save his friend. He commanded that sacred fires throughout the empire be extinguished until Hephaestion received the honors due to a hero. But more telling than these public displays of grief was Alexander's private response to the loss. Witnesses reported that he lay beside Hephaestion's body for 3 days, refusing to eat or drink, speaking to his dead friend as if he was still alive. The death of Hephaestion marked the end of Alexander's last connection to his own humanity. With his friend gone, there was no one left who could remind him of who he used to be, no one who could speak to the boy beneath the crown. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's decline accelerated dramatically. The man who had always been prone to excess became completely unrestrained. The king who had once balanced cruelty with mercy became purely vindictive. But most painfully of all, he calls out for the boy he used to be. The young prince of Macedonia who dreamed of heroic adventures and noble deeds. That boy died somewhere on the road to empire, killed by the very success that was supposed to make him immortal. The Persian physicians who tend to him in his final hours speak of the price that the gods exact from mortals who try to become divine. They have seen this before in the histories of their people, the pattern of rise and fall that marks the careers of all conquerors. Alexander is not the first man to mistake conquest for immortality, and he will not be the last. These Persian doctors bring with them centuries of accumulated wisdom about the nature of power and its effects on the human soul. They have served kings who ruled vast empires, who commanded millions of subjects, who were worshipped as gods by their people. They know the signs of what they call the divine sickness, the madness that comes to mortals who begin to believe their own propaganda about their godlike nature. They have seen it destroy kings greater than Alexander, men who ruled longer and more successfully but fell victim to the same delusion of transcending human limitations. When they examine Alexander, they see not just physical illness but spiritual corruption. The fever burning through his body is merely the external manifestation of a deeper sickness, one that has been growing in his soul for years. They speak among themselves in ancient Persian, using words that have no direct translation into Greek but carry meanings that Alexander's Macedonian companions instinctively understand. They are speaking of the price that must be paid when mortals try to steal fire from the gods. As his condition worsens, Alexander's body begins to shut down with agonizing slowness. The fever burns through him like fire consuming dry wood. His famous strength, the physical power that carried him through 100 battles, abandons him bit by bit. The man who once seemed capable of anything becomes as helpless as an infant. The progression of his illness becomes a grotesque parody of his military campaigns. Just as he had conquered territories one by one, systematically reducing opposition until entire regions submitted to his will, the disease conquers his body piece by piece. First, his legendary stamina fails him. The man who could march for days without rest finds himself exhausted by the simple act of sitting up in bed. The endurance that carried him across 3 continents evaporates like morning mist. Next, his coordination begins to deteriorate. His hands, once steady enough to drive a spear through the heart of an enemy at full gallop, begin to shake uncontrollably. His legs, which carried him up the walls of Tyre and across the mountains of Afghanistan, can no longer support his weight. His voice, which once inspired armies and intimidated kings, becomes a hoarse whisper that his attendants must strain to hear. The oratory that once moved men to follow him into impossible battles is reduced to incoherent mumblings that make no sense even to those who know him best. But perhaps most cruel of all, his mind remains sharp enough to understand what is happening to him. Alexander is forced to watch his own decline with the analytical intelligence that once made him the greatest general of his age. He can see death approaching step by step, can feel his life force ebbing away drop by drop. The historical accounts of his final moments vary, but all of them capture the essential tragedy of his death. When asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander supposedly whispers to the strongest, a final act of spite that ensures his life's work will be destroyed in civil war. But there are other accounts that suggest a different final moment, one that is perhaps even more tragic. Some sources claim that in his final breath, Alexander tried to remove his ring, the symbol of his royal authority, and give it to someone, anyone, who might preserve what he had built. But his strength failed him, and the ring fell from his nerveless fingers to the floor of his chamber in Babylon. The sound it made hitting the marble was the sound of an empire beginning to collapse. The ring itself was a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, carved from a single enormous emerald and bearing the image of Zeus holding a thunderbolt. Alexander had worn it every day since his coronation, and it had become a symbol of his authority throughout the empire. When it fell from his dying fingers, the sound echoed through the chamber like a funeral bell. The few witnesses present understood immediately that they were watching not just the death of a king, but the end of an age. Perdiccas, who was standing closest to the bed, made no move to pick up the ring. Neither did any of the other generals present. They all understood that whoever claimed it first would be marking himself as Alexander's successor. A dangerous position in a room full of ambitious men. So the ring lay on the marble floor beside Alexander's deathbed, glinting in the torchlight like a fallen star. It would remain there for hours after his death, a symbol of an authority that had died with its bearer. Alexander the Great died on June 11th, 323 BC, at the age of 32. His body had been ravaged by fever, but it was his soul that had paid the ultimate price for his boundless ambition. The boy who dreamed of being a hero died as a tyrant, alone and unmourned by those who had once loved him. The moment of death itself was surprisingly peaceful after the agony of his final illness. Alexander simply stopped breathing, his face relaxing into an expression of relief rather than pain. It was as if death came to him not as an enemy but as a friend, offering escape from the prison his life had become. But the peace of his final moment was shattered almost immediately by the chaos that erupted throughout the palace. The news of his death spread like wildfire, triggering a scramble for power that would tear his empire apart within hours. The immediate aftermath of his death proved that his fears about the fate of his empire were entirely justified. Within hours of his last breath, his generals were at each other's throats, each claiming the right to succeed him. The unity he had tried to create through conquest and marriage dissolved like sugar in rain. The scene in the palace immediately after Alexander's death was one of barely controlled chaos. The generals who had maintained an uneasy peace while he lived immediately began jockeying for position, their long-suppressed ambitions finally given free rein. Perdiccas, still holding the royal seal, tried to assert his authority as regent, but his claims were immediately challenged by Ptolemy, who argued that the empire should be divided among Alexander's most capable generals. Seleucus supported Ptolemy's position, but only because he saw an opportunity to claim the rich eastern provinces for himself. Antigonus opposed division, but only because he believed he could eventually claim the entire empire for himself. The arguments that erupted in Alexander's death chamber revealed the depth of the hatred and resentment that had been building among his generals for years. Men who had fought side by side for decades hurled accusations and threats at each other with vicious intensity. His wife, Roxana, pregnant with his heir, became a pawn in the power struggle. His infant son, Alexander IV, would be used as a figurehead by various claimants before being murdered while still a child. The dynasty that Alexander thought would rule forever ended in blood and betrayal within a generation. Roxana's pregnancy, which should have provided stability and continuity to the empire, instead became another source of conflict. Some generals saw the unborn child as their ticket to power, planning to rule as regents until the boy came of age. Others viewed the pregnancy as an obstacle to their own ambitions. The treatment of Roxana during the succession crisis reveals the utter callousness of Alexander's supposed friends and followers. Instead of protecting the grieving widow of their former king, they used her as a political tool, moving her around like a piece on a game board. The infant, Alexander IV, when he was finally born, never had a chance at a normal life. From the moment of his birth, he was both the most powerful person in the world as Alexander's heir, and the most powerless as a baby dependent on adults who cared nothing for his welfare. The empire itself was carved up among his generals like a feast among starving men. The Diadochi, the successors, fought over the scraps of Alexander's legacy for decades, turning the lands he had united into battlegrounds once again. The dream of a unified world empire died with its creator. The division of the empire was accomplished with breathtaking speed and ruthless efficiency. Within months of Alexander's death, his generals had carved up his life's work like butchers dividing a carcass. Ptolemy claimed Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. Seleucus took control of the eastern provinces, creating an empire that stretched from Syria to India. Antigonus seized much of Asia Minor and would spend decades fighting to reclaim Alexander's entire legacy. Macedonia itself fell into chaos, with competing claimants fighting over Alexander's homeland, while his mother, Olympias, tried desperately to preserve the dynasty for her infant grandson. The wars of succession that followed Alexander's death were more brutal and destructive than any of his original conquests. The generals who had learned the art of war from Alexander now turned those skills against each other, creating a cycle of violence that would last for generations. Cities that had surrendered peacefully to Alexander found themselves besieged repeatedly as different claimants fought for control. Populations that had accepted Macedonian rule with resignation found themselves caught in the crossfire of civil wars that made their original conquest seem benevolent by comparison. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all is how quickly Alexander himself was forgotten by the people he had conquered. The cities he founded were renamed, the statues erected in his honor were pulled down. The temples built to his divinity were rededicated to other gods. The immortality he sought through conquest proved to be as ephemeral as morning mist. The process of forgetting Alexander began almost before his body was cold. Local populations, freed from the necessity of pretending loyalty to a living king, quickly reverted to their traditional customs and beliefs. The coins bearing Alexander's image were melted down and recast with the faces of new rulers. The schools where children had been forced to learn Greek history returned to teaching local traditions. The festivals celebrating Alexander's victories were quietly abandoned in favor of older, more authentic celebrations. Within a century of his death, Alexander had become a figure of myth rather than history. The stories told about him were fantasies, adventures designed to entertain rather than educate. The real Alexander, the complex and ultimately tragic figure who conquered the world and lost his soul, disappeared beneath layers of legend and romance. The transformation of Alexander from historical figure to mythological character was aided by the very scale of his achievements. His conquests had been so vast, so rapid, so seemingly impossible that people found it easier to believe in a supernatural explanation than to accept that a mortal man had accomplished such things. This transformation of Alexander from man to myth represents the final tragedy of his story. He spent his life trying to become immortal through his deeds, never realizing that immortality achieved through conquest is the most fleeting of all. The empires of warriors crumble, but the works of poets and philosophers endure. If Alexander had been content to be a great king rather than a god, if he had learned to value wisdom over glory, compassion over conquest, he might have achieved the lasting greatness he desired. Instead, his relentless pursuit of immortal fame led him to an early grave and left his name attached to a legacy of destruction rather than creation. The failure of Alexander's empire was not inevitable. With proper planning and genuine concern for his subjects' welfare, he could have created something that truly lasted. But his obsession with personal glory prevented him from building the institutional foundations that would have survived his death. The cities he founded could have become centers of learning and culture, bridges between East and West that would have enriched both civilizations. Instead, they became symbols of foreign domination, resented by their inhabitants and abandoned by their supposed protectors. The cultural synthesis he claimed to seek could have created a new form of civilization, combining the best elements of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. Instead, his forced marriages and imposed customs created resentment and conflict that poisoned relationships between different peoples for generations. The physical cause of Alexander's death remains a mystery to this day. Some historians believe he died of malaria or typhoid fever, diseases that were common in the ancient world and could easily have struck down even the strongest man. Others suggest that he died of poisoning, victim of a conspiracy among his own followers who had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behavior. The malaria theory is supported by the descriptions of his symptoms: the high fever, the chills, the weakness that seemed to come in waves. Malaria was endemic in the marshlands around Babylon, and even the strongest constitution would have been vulnerable to infection. The typhoid theory points to Alexander's consumption of contaminated water or food during his final days in Babylon. The city's sanitation systems, advanced for their time, were still primitive by modern standards, and foodborne illnesses could easily have infected even careful diners. But there are more exotic theories as well. Some scholars point to the symptoms described in ancient sources and suggest that Alexander may have died of acute pancreatitis, brought on by years of heavy drinking. Others believe he may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that could account for his paralysis and difficulty breathing. The pancreatitis theory is particularly compelling given Alexander's well-documented history of alcohol abuse. The disease can strike suddenly and prove fatal within days, especially in an era before modern medical intervention. The neurological theories suggest that Alexander may have suffered from an autoimmune disorder triggered by stress and exhaustion. The symptoms of Guillain-Barré syndrome, including paralysis and respiratory failure, match many of the accounts of Alexander's final illness. The most intriguing theory, however, is that Alexander didn't die of any disease at all, but rather fell into a deep coma that was mistaken for death by the physicians of his time. This theory suggests that he may have suffered from a rare condition that mimics death so closely that even trained doctors can be fooled. This possibility gains credibility from the ancient reports that Alexander's body showed no signs of decay for days after his supposed death. In the hot climate of Babylon, decomposition should have begun within hours. But multiple sources claim that his body remained fresh and lifelike for an unusually long time. Imagine, if you will, the ultimate irony. Alexander the Great, buried alive because his final conquest was so complete that it fooled death itself. It's a fitting end for a man whose entire life was built on the blurring of lines between reality and myth, between mortal ambition and divine aspiration. But regardless of what killed Alexander's body, there's no mystery about what killed his soul. That death began years before his physical demise, the moment he stopped seeing other people as human, beings deserving of compassion, and started seeing them as obstacles to his glory or tools for his ambition. The spiritual death of Alexander can be traced through a series of increasingly callous decisions that revealed his growing disconnection from normal human emotions. The execution of Parmenion, the murder of Cletus, the forced marriages at Susa, the massacre of prisoners who slowed his advance. Each of these acts carved away another piece of his humanity. By the time of his physical death, the process was complete. The man who died in Babylon was no longer recognizably the same person as the boy who had left Macedonia 13 years earlier. The transformation was so complete that it amounted to a kind of death and rebirth, except that what was reborn was something monstrous rather than divine. The boy who wept when he thought there were no more worlds to conquer died long before the man who breathed his last in Babylon. That earlier death, the death of Alexander's humanity, was the real tragedy of his story. Everything that followed was simply the inevitable consequence of that spiritual decay. This spiritual transformation didn't happen in isolation. It was facilitated by the very nature of absolute power and the way it corrupts those who wield it. Alexander's descent into tyranny follows a pattern that historians have observed throughout the ages. From the Roman emperors to modern dictators, power, especially unlimited power, creates a feedback loop that gradually disconnects rulers from the reality experienced by their subjects. Surrounded by flatterers and dependent on the compliance of subordinates, powerful individuals lose the ability to receive honest feedback about their actions and decisions. In Alexander's case, this process was accelerated by the extraordinary nature of his achievements. When a man accomplishes things that seem impossible, it becomes easy for him to believe that normal human limitations don't apply to him. Modern parallels to Alexander's story are not hard to find. Every age produces its would-be conquerors. Men and women who believe that enough power, enough success, enough acclaim will somehow fill the void inside them and grant them the immortality they crave. In our own time, we see echoes of Alexander's fatal ambition in the behavior of tech billionaires who speak of conquering death itself, of politicians who believe they are chosen by destiny to reshape the world, of celebrities who construct elaborate mythologies around their own significance. The mechanisms of corruption have evolved, but the underlying psychology remains the same. The modern equivalent of Alexander's Persian flatterers can be found in the armies of publicists, consultants, and advisors who tell powerful people what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Social media has created new forms of the divine pretensions that destroyed Alexander. The ability to command the attention of millions of followers, to shape public opinion with a single post, to be worshipped by strangers around the world. These create the same dangerous feedback loops that convinced Alexander of his own divinity. But Alexander's story stands as an eternal warning about the price of unchecked ambition. It shows us that the higher we climb, the more we risk losing sight of what made the climb worthwhile in the first place. It demonstrates that true greatness lies not in conquering others, but in conquering ourselves, not in accumulating power, but in learning to use it wisely. The lessons embedded in Alexander's life and death are as relevant today as they were 2,300 years ago. They speak to fundamental questions about human nature, about the relationship between power and corruption, about the price we pay for our ambitions. His story teaches us that external achievement cannot cure internal emptiness, that public success cannot heal private wounds, that all the conquest in the world cannot fill a soul that has forgotten what it means to be human. The real tragedy of Alexander the Great is not that he died young, but that he lived without ever understanding what would have made his life meaningful. He conquered the world, but never learned to conquer his own demons. He sought immortality in all the wrong places, and died having achieved only a hollow mockery of the glory he desired. In the end, Alexander's story is not really about conquest or empire or military genius. It's about the human condition, about the eternal struggle between our aspirations and our limitations, our dreams and our realities. It's about what happens when we lose sight of our humanity in pursuit of something we think is greater than humanity. The psychological autopsy of Alexander reveals a man who achieved everything he thought he wanted and discovered too late that he had wanted the wrong things. The power he accumulated became a burden that crushed his spirit. The glory he won became a prison that isolated him from genuine human connection. His empire, built to last forever, collapsed because it was held together not by shared values or institutional strength, but by the force of one man's personality. When that personality was corrupted by power and ultimately destroyed by its own contradictions, there was nothing left to prevent the empire's disintegration. The marble floors of the palace in Babylon are cold now, worn smooth by the passage of centuries and the footsteps of countless visitors who come to see where the great conqueror died. The empire he built is dust. The cities he founded are ruins. The glory he sought has faded like winter snow in spring sunshine. The palace itself has become a monument to the transience of earthly power. Tourists from around the world come to walk through the same halls where Alexander breathed his last, to stand in the same chambers where his empire died with him. But most of them leave understanding nothing more than they did when they arrived. They see the ruins and marvel at the scale of ancient ambition, but they miss the deeper lessons written in stone and shadow. The real story of Babylon is not about the greatness of the empire that died there, but about the price that was paid for that empire's creation. Every stone in those ancient walls was set by hands that trembled with exhaustion. Every decoration was crafted by artists working under the threat of death. Every corridor echoes with the footsteps of people who were never asked if they wanted to be part of Alexander's dream. But the questions his life raised remain as urgent today as they were 2,300 years ago. What is the price of ambition? How much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of our dreams? At what point does the pursuit of greatness become the pursuit of destruction? These are the questions that make Alexander's story timeless. The reason why we still tell it in hushed tones and study it with fascination mixed with horror. His life was a cautionary tale written in blood and stone, a reminder that the gods still punish mortals who fly too close to the sun. The psychological profile that emerges from a careful study of Alexander's life reveals a man trapped in a cycle of achievement and emptiness that could never be broken by external success. Each conquest left him hungrier for the next. Each victory made the prospect of defeat more terrifying. Each moment of glory made the inevitable return to ordinary mortality more unbearable. He was, in many ways, the first modern celebrity, a person whose public image became so divorced from his private reality that he lost the ability to distinguish between the two. The Alexander who existed in the minds of his subjects was a godlike figure capable of anything. The Alexander who existed in private was a deeply damaged man struggling with demons that no amount of external validation could exorcise. The contrast between public image and private reality created a psychological pressure that would have broken most people much earlier than it broke Alexander. The constant need to live up to an impossible standard, to be always worthy of the worship and adoration of millions, created a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. In his final days, as fever consumed his body and delirium clouded his mind, Alexander finally began to see the true cost of the life he had chosen. The empire he had built through the sacrifice of others had ultimately demanded the sacrifice of himself. As we leave the palace in Babylon and walk back into our own time, we carry with us the memory of a young man who conquered the world and lost everything that mattered. His story echoes across the centuries, like a bell tolling for all the dreams that turn to nightmares, all the victories that become defeats, all the immortal aspirations that end in very mortal graves. The echoes of Alexander's story reverberate through every age that has followed his own. We see him in every conqueror who mistakes force for leadership, in every leader who confuses fear with respect, in every powerful person who believes that their position exempts them from the moral laws that govern ordinary people. We see him in the Roman emperors who declared themselves gods and died as paranoiacs. We see him in the medieval kings who claimed divine right and ended up destroying their own dynasties. We see him in the modern dictators who promise paradise and deliver hell. But we also see the possibility of different choices, different paths, different endings. For every Alexander, history provides examples of leaders who wielded great power without being corrupted by it, who achieved lasting greatness through service rather than conquest, who found immortality through what they built rather than what they destroyed. The greatest lesson of Alexander's life may be this: that true immortality comes not from conquering others, but from inspiring them. Not from building empires that will crumble, but from planting ideas that will flourish. Not from reaching for the unreachable, but from learning to find meaning in what is within our grasp. This lesson is particularly relevant in our contemporary world, where the mechanisms of power and influence have evolved, but the fundamental temptations remain the same. Social media platforms give ordinary people the ability to command audiences that ancient kings could never have dreamed of. Technology companies wield influence over daily life that exceeds anything Alexander ever achieved. The question is whether we will learn from Alexander's example or repeat his mistakes. Will we use our new forms of power to serve others or to serve ourselves? Will we seek to build things that last, or to accumulate achievements that feed our egos? Will we remember that we are human beings first, and successful people second? Alexander reached for the stars and fell to earth. His tragedy is complete, his story told. But the choice of how we respond to his example, how we balance our own ambitions with our humanity, remains ours to make. The path Alexander chose led inevitably to the cold marble floors of Babylon, to a death unmarked by genuine mourning, to an empire that collapsed before his body was buried. But there were other paths available to him, just as there are other paths available to us. He could have chosen to be remembered as a builder rather than a destroyer, as a liberator rather than a conqueror, as a servant of his people rather than their master. The boy who dreamed of heroic adventure could have found ways to achieve genuine heroism without sacrificing his humanity on the altar of ambition. The tragedy is that he had everything necessary to make these better choices. He had intelligence, courage, charisma, and opportunity. He had teachers who tried to guide him toward wisdom, friends who attempted to keep him grounded, and experiences that should have taught him about the value of human life and dignity. But he also had something that proved stronger than all of these positive influences: an appetite for glory that could never be satisfied, a hunger for significance that devoured everything else in his life, including his own soul. In the silence of history, we can still hear the echo of his final breath, the whisper of his dying words, the sound of his ring hitting the marble floor. These sounds remind us that every empire falls, every conqueror dies, and every dream of earthly immortality proves to be just that, a dream. But they also remind us that while we live, we have the power to choose what kind of legacy we leave behind. We can choose to be remembered for what we conquered or what we created, for the fear we inspired or the love we shared, for the world we took or the world we gave. Alexander made his choice long ago in the dust and heat of ancient battlefields. The consequences of that choice echo still in the ruins of Babylon and the pages of history books. Now, as always, the choice is ours. The cost of conquering the world, as Alexander learned too late, is the world itself. The price of boundless ambition is the very soul that drives it. These are the lessons written in the life and death of the man who was called great. Lessons that remain as relevant today as they were when the marble floors of Babylon first grew cold beneath his dying body. But perhaps there's hope in this tragedy. Perhaps in understanding Alexander's failure, we can avoid repeating it. Perhaps in seeing how his humanity died long before his body, we can choose to nurture our own humanity instead of sacrificing it on the altar of ambition. The ultimate irony of Alexander's story is that he achieved a form of immortality after all, but not the kind he sought. He became eternal not as a hero but as a warning, not as an inspiration but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the price of forgetting our own humanity. In conquering the world, Alexander lost himself. In losing himself, he found a different kind of immortality, one he never sought and probably wouldn't have wanted. He became eternal not as a hero but as a warning, not as an inspiration but as a cautionary tale. Every generation since his death has found new relevance in his story, new applications for the lessons his life taught. He has become more influential in death than he ever was in life, his tragedy serving as a mirror in which we can see our own potential for both greatness and destruction. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy of all for a man who reached so high and fell so far. In his failure, he achieved something his success never could. He taught us what it truly means to be human. The boy from Macedonia who dreamed of being a hero teaches us, through his transformation into a tyrant, that heroism isn't about conquering others, it's about conquering ourselves. It's about choosing compassion over conquest, wisdom over glory, love over legacy. In the end, the most tragic thing about Alexander the Great isn't that he died young. It's that he never learned how to live. He spent 32 years on Earth, but never discovered what it meant to be truly alive, never understood that the only kingdom worth conquering is the kingdom within. As the torches dim and the shadows lengthen, as we leave the cold marble halls of Babylon behind and return to our own time, we carry with us the weight of his story. It's a weight that should make us pause, make us reflect, make us question our own ambitions and the price we're willing to pay for them. The greatest empire ever built crumbled to dust. The mightiest conqueror ever born died forgotten by those he conquered. But the questions his life raised, the lessons his death teaches, these remain as immortal as the stars Alexander once thought he could reach. In the flickering torchlight of history, Alexander's shadow still falls across our modern world. Every corporate boardroom where executives plot hostile takeovers. Every political campaign where candidates promise impossible dreams. Every social media influencer chasing followers like Alexander chased cities. We see echoes of his fatal ambition. The technology changes, but the human heart remains the same. We still believe, somewhere deep in our souls, that if we can just achieve enough, conquer enough, accumulate enough, we will finally fill the emptiness that gnaws at us. We still think that external validation can cure internal wounds, that public triumph can heal private pain. Alexander's final gift to us, bought with his life and paid for with his soul, is the knowledge that this belief is a lie. The most successful conqueror in history died alone, unmourned, unforgotten by those he thought he was conquering for. His empire, built to last forever, didn't survive a single generation. The wisdom that emerges from Alexander's tragedy is hard-won and bitter, but it is wisdom nonetheless. It teaches us that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in controlling ourselves. That lasting achievement comes not from taking what we want, but from giving what we can. It reminds us that the only conquests worth making are the ones that make us better people. The only empires worth building are the ones that serve human flourishing. The only immortality worth seeking is the kind that comes from making the world a little better than we found it. Good night, and remember, the greatest victories are often the ones we choose not to fight. And the truest immortality lies not in being remembered for what we took from the world, but for what we gave to it. In conquering the world, Alexander lost himself. In losing himself, he found a different kind of immortality, teaching us through his failure what it truly means to be human.